What if the truth is not what breaks us, but what saves us from the void? She sat in a room where everything was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that isn't soothing but sterile, cold, like a hospital room that has been scrubbed of all evidence that pain ever existed there. No shouts, no arguments, no questions. Just the hum of something unspoken, thick in the air. She wasn't afraid of chaos. She was afraid of this carefully arranged silence. Because deep down, she knew what it really was. A cage. Not made of bars, but of things left unsaid. She is no one, and she is everyone. Not a character, but a shape, an outline of the people who have stared into the quiet conformity of everyday life and felt something screaming beneath it. A mother pretending not to notice her child's confusion. A student swallowing questions in a lecture hall. A citizen mouthing slogans they don't believe. All smiling, all silent. This isn't peace. It's erased. There is a lie we tell ourselves. About silence, that it is neutral, that it is safe. But silence, when it is chosen in the presence of truth, is never harmless. It is surrender dressed as serenity. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her study of totalitarianism, warned us that evil does not always come with horns or violence. Sometimes it comes in silence, a bureaucrat processing orders without asking questions, a neighbor watching someone disappear and saying nothing. She called it the banality of evil, not monstrous, but mundane. Evil, she said, often doesn't need to shout. It only needs people who won't speak. In the quiet, she felt the weight of this complicity. It wasn't that she didn't know what was wrong. It was that everyone around her seemed to have agreed not to see it. The discomfort she felt wasn't madness. It was clarity gnawing at the edges of a world pretending to be whole. We like to believe that silence is wisdom, that those who speak less know more. But history tells a different story. Some silences are not born of wisdom. They are born of fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being right. Fear of being alone in what you know. This fear doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It rationalizes. It tells you that speaking will only make things worse. That truth is dangerous. That it's better, for everyone, if you keep it inside. But what happens when an entire world keeps everything inside? She began to realize that silence was not her shield. It was her sickness. And in that stillness, a question began to echo. What if breaking the silence is the only way to become real again? This story isn't just about her. It's about us. It's about the storm that brews not outside the window, but inside the soul. When what is true becomes too heavy to keep buried. This isn't a story. It's a diagnosis of a culture, of consciousness, and of the cost of swallowing what must be said. There is a strange kind of silence that doesn't feel like absence, but like presence, the presence of something being deliberately withheld, a silence too precise to be accidental. This is the soundproof cage. It isn't built with bars or chains, but with hesitation, with polite smiles, with averted eyes, with the gentle lie that says, "It's not my place." In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram set out to understand how ordinary people could be complicit in extraordinary cruelty. His experiment was simple. Participants were asked to deliver electric shocks to a stranger because an authority figure told them to. The shocks weren't real, but the obedience was. Most participants complied, despite the screams, the protests, the apparent suffering. Why? Because silence was easier than resistance. Because responsibility could be outsourced to someone in a lab coat. Because saying, "I was just following orders," sounded better than saying, "I was afraid to speak." Around the same time, Solomon Asch ran another experiment. Groups of people were asked to compare the lengths of lines. The task was obvious, until the others in the room, all secretly in on the experiment, began to give wrong answers. Under Social pressure. Most participants followed along, even when their own eyes told them otherwise. What both studies revealed is disturbing. The truth is not the most powerful force in a room. Agreement is, even false agreement. We'd rather be wrong in a group than right alone. We'd rather remain silent than risk the awkward violence of dissent. But what does that cost? History is full of people who claimed they didn't know. Neighbors who heard nothing. Citizens who minded their own business. Entire societies that watched as others vanished, into prisons, into ghettos, into history, and said nothing, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, warned us of this tendency. He believed that freedom, true freedom, is terrifying. It comes with weight, with responsibility. And when that burden becomes too heavy, people retreat. They conform. They obey. They go quiet. Silence becomes sanctuary. But it's a sanctuary made of shadows. She, our unnamed witness, knows this feeling, not just of fear, but of the slow, creeping sense that to speak would make her complicit in a new way, that words once spoken can't be denied. And so she waits. She watches. She tells herself the others must know more, must be right, must have reasons. And yet, the ache remains. The soundproof cage is not enforced from the outside. It is built from within. Each time we feel the tug of conscience and choose comfort. Instead, we reinforce the walls. Each time we witness a lie and look away, we reinforce the walls. Each time we hear the cry of truth and pretend it was the wind, we tighten the lock ourselves. This is the psychology of silence, not as peace, but as paralysis. It is tempting to believe we are different, that we would have spoken up, that we would have shouted in the streets, protected the vulnerable, defied the orders. But ask yourself, when have you chosen silence? Not out of peace, but out of fear. The truth is uncomfortable. And she, this woman trapped in the quiet, begins to see that she is not alone. She is surrounded by others just like her, quiet, polite, disappearing behind their own reflections. She is not just one person. She is us. The question is no longer, why is she silent? It's, why are we? Truth doesn't arrive politely. It does not knock on the door and wait for permission to enter. It bursts in, uninvited, unrelenting, and often too late to soften the damage. Unlike silence, which settles in like fog, cold, gentle, and hard. To notice, truth comes like fire, and fire consumes. We like to believe that truth is noble, that it's something we all want. But the truth, in its rawest form, demands something we are often unwilling to give: the death of illusion. And illusions, once they've rooted themselves in the psyche, do not go quietly. Carl Jung once wrote that every individual carries a shadow, the repressed, denied parts of ourselves we pretend not to see. The more vehemently we reject these truths, the stronger they grow in the dark. Left unexamined, the shadow doesn't disappear. It leaks. It contaminates thoughts. It distorts relationships. It projects itself onto others. Until we no longer see reality, we only see our defenses. This is why truth feels violent, because it wages war on the falsehoods we've mistaken for safety. When someone speaks a truth we've buried, it doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like betrayal, like exposure, like a wound being ripped open just when we thought it had scarred over. History is littered with the broken lives of those who told the truth too soon or too loudly. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent years in a Soviet labor camp, not because he raised a weapon, but because he raised a mirror. His book, The Gulag Archipelago, exposed the system of terror operating in the shadows of Soviet power, a truth so unbearable to the regime that it tried to erase him entirely. George Orwell, long before, becoming a cultural shorthand for dystopia, was reviled by many in his time. 1984 and Animal Farm were not comfortable books. They were acts of resistance. Orwell understood that to reveal the mechanisms of control is to threaten those who rely on silence to maintain it. And then there's Nina Simone, who once said, "An artist's duty is to reflect the times." Her music didn't soothe, it disturbed, it forced a reckoning. In doing so, she lost radio play, popularity, and financial security. But she didn't lose herself, because the price of truth is not just exile from society, it's often exile from comfort, from certainty, from the easy categories we've used to organize the world. But the reward is something deeper. To speak truth in a world built on lies is to reclaim authorship of your own mind. It is to say, "I see what is. I will not pretend otherwise." That kind of defiance doesn't just change the speaker, it alters the terrain. Even when whispered, the truth reverberates. Even when crushed, it leaves an imprint. The terrifying part isn't just that truth might be painful, it's that once spoken, it changes things. Irrevocably. Relationships fracture, institutions falter, identities dissolve. This is why people fear it, not because it's false, but because it's final. To speak truth is to destroy who you were when you believed the lie. And so, she, the woman we've been following, not only feared the silence. She feared the moment silence would break. The moment her voice would escape her body like a confession. Not because she didn't know the truth, but because once said aloud, it could never be unsaid. She wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of being right, too early, too alone. But in that moment of terror, there is something sacred. Because to speak the truth is to risk exile. And sometimes in exile, we find what we were never meant to forget, our freedom. It starts subtly, not with the shriek of a tyrant, but with a smile on a screen. A well-lit anchor reciting lines written by someone you'll never meet. A corporate slogan that sounds like comfort but promises nothing. A scrolling feed that feels endless but says nothing. This isn't just misinformation. This is something deeper, something structural. Lies can be told, but more dangerously, they can be built. Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, understood this all too well. In his 1928 book, Propaganda, he didn't hide his intentions. He believed that the masses needed to be managed, steered by what he called an invisible government. Not through violence, but through narratives, through repetition, through the subtle suggestion that what you're being told is not just a message, it is the truth. But truth in these systems is not an objective. It's an obstacle. Bernays helped tobacco companies market cigarettes to women by branding them as symbols of liberation. He made bacon and eggs the American breakfast, not by nutrition science, but by orchestrating a PR campaign through doctors paid to agree. And it worked, not because people were stupid, but because the lie was everywhere. Seamless, elegant. Decades later, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote Manufacturing Consent, showing how media systems don't need to lie to deceive. All they need to do is decide what gets repeated and what gets ignored, who gets quoted, who gets silenced, what stories are told and which disappear before reaching the air. The result is a kind of informational gerrymandering, shaping public consciousness without ever appearing to do so. We assume censorship is always obvious, but in reality, it is often algorithmic, invisible, automated. Today, truth isn't shouted down, it's drowned in noise. The signal gets buried beneath sponsored trends, influencer distractions, and corporate-approved content that is emotionally charged but intellectually vacant, Neil. Postman warned of this in Amusing Ourselves to Death. He argued that the real threat to truth was not Orwell's vision of state-enforced suppression, but Huxley's, A world where truth becomes irrelevant because we're too entertained, too distracted, too sedated by spectacle to care. And so the infrastructure forms, not a single lie, but a system of silence, a culture of deflection. A shared agreement not to see too much, not to dig too deep. She feels it now, this architecture, the artificial calm, the sense that there are things everyone knows, but no one dares to name. The quiet horror of a society built not on ignorance, but on strategic forgetfulness. She walks through streets lined with screens, each glowing with curated realities. She scrolls past headlines crafted to provoke outrage, but never reflection. She listens to voices that speak loud, but say nothing, and then something different, a faint signal. A voice, perhaps, not as loud, but unmistakably real. A truth not delivered, but discovered. And in that moment, she hears it, the crack in the system. Because that's the thing about systems built on silence. They depend on everyone. Playing along. Once someone stops pretending, the illusion begins to fall apart. She isn't just noticing the lies. She is becoming intolerant of them. The slogans feel hollow. The press releases feel choreographed. The consensus starts to feel manufactured. And this realization doesn't make her paranoid. It makes her dangerous. Because the most subversive act in a world like this is to believe your own eyes. She remembers the feeling of the soundproof cage, the pressure to conform, the comfort of shared delusion. But now she knows. What felt like madness was actually clarity. What felt like isolation was the early stage of awakening. The gaslight is flickering, and in its dimming glow, she sees the outlines of a deeper world. A world where silence is not absence, but suppression. Where conformity is not harmony, but control. Where the infrastructure of lies is not maintained by tyrants, but by ordinary people too afraid to ask, what if everything we've accepted is a performance? The realization doesn't comfort her, but it does make her free. There is a strange power in crowds, a force that feels both ancient and unnerving. It is a power that can lift individuals into collective ecstasy or drag them down into shared silence. It is a power that blurs the line between truth and illusion, reason and surrender. More than a century ago, Gustave Le Bon described this phenomenon in The Crowd. He observed how individuals, when swallowed by the mass, lose their sense of self. Reason gives way to emotion. Thought becomes a whisper beneath the roar of the group. The crowd moves as one. Not because each person understands the direction, but because the collective pulse overrides individual judgment. This is not just unity. It is hypnosis. Today, psychologists like Matthias Desmet call it mass formation psychosis, a condition where large groups become hypnotized by shared fear and uncertainty, leading to the suppression of dissent and the erosion of critical thinking. The individual mind, overwhelmed by anxiety and isolation, finds refuge in the collective narrative. Silence becomes virtue, questioning becomes taboo. Imagine standing in a room where everyone nods, repeats the same phrases, reacts with the same fears. The pressure to conform is invisible, but undeniable. The unspoken rule, to dissent, is to betray the group, to break the fragile trust holding it together. Fear is the glue. Psychological trauma bonding, a term from clinical psychology, helps explain this. When people endure crisis together, whether real or manufactured, they form intense emotional attachments to their perceived protectors, governments, media, social movements. This bond can suppress individual autonomy as the need for safety outweighs the need for truth. The more uncertain the world becomes, the stronger this bond grows. Fear doesn't just silence, it sedates. We see this in the modern era. During the global pandemic, millions found themselves swept into a shared state of anxiety and compliance. Mask mandates, lockdowns, shifting rules, each reinforced by an invisible chorus of agreement and social policing. To question was to risk isolation or worse. Cancel culture became a modern witch hunt, where deviation was punished not by courts, but by social exclusion. Echo chambers amplified the collective voice, drowning out nuance and complexity. She watches this with growing unease, not because she is immune to fear, but because she senses something deeper at work, something that transcends individual crises and points to a systemic pattern. She feels the pull of the mass, the lull of shared emotion that promises belonging but demands surrender. And yet, in her silence, a seed of resistance grows. What if silence is not peace? What if compliance is not consent? The crowd may seem unstoppable, but it is not invincible. The trance can be broken. The voice can return. She begins to test the boundaries, to speak softly in the void, to question the questions, to hold fast to the flicker of individual thought, amidst the roaring storm of collective hypnosis. This resistance is small but powerful. It is the crack in the perfect illusion, because beneath the mass's hypnotic spell, the truth still waits. And she, our symbol, our witness, is ready to find it. The question no longer is just why she feared the silence, but how she will shatter it. The breaking voice. 550 words. The silence has stretched too long. It is no longer a refuge, no longer a shield. It is a weight, crushing, suffocating, unbearable. In this void, she stands at a precipice, feeling the unbearable pressure of truth held back. The stillness is not peace. It is a cage tightening around the spirit. She chooses to break it. To speak in a world conditioned to silence is to risk everything. It is to face isolation, ridicule, even persecution. Yet this choice is also a reclaiming, a fierce declaration of humanity, of existence, of meaning. Viktor Frankl, who survived the darkest depths of human cruelty, understood this deeply. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote about the ultimate freedom, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. The freedom to speak truth, even when the world demands silence, is an act of existential courage. It is a cost, the price of meaning itself. She is no longer just an individual. She is an archetype for every soul that has dared to speak in the face of oppressive quiet. Chelsea Manning, who exposed dark secrets at great personal cost. Julian Assange, whose revelations shook global power but condemned him to exile. And endless legal battles. Whistleblowers in corporations, governments, and institutions whose voices shattered the carefully constructed illusions but paid with freedom, reputation, even safety. Each story echoes the painful paradox. Truth is a burden, but also a liberation. When silence is the norm, the voice of one becomes sacred. It is a beacon cutting through the darkness, a fragile flame against the howling wind. Her breaking voice stirs others. It awakens ears long dulled by compliance. It ignites sparks of recognition and courage. The oppressive quiet begins to crack. No longer alone, she finds a chorus growing in the distance. Others who refuse to be muted, who understand that silence is complicity. This is the moment of transformation. Speaking truth is never gentle. It bites, it wounds, it demands sacrifice. But it also restores authenticity. It reclaims the fragments of self lost to fear and silence. To break the silence is to say, I am here. I will not disappear. I will speak. Even if the cost is exile, the voice that once trembled now carries power. It refuses to be drowned out by the machinery of deception, the weight of conformity, the fog of fear. Because in the breaking voice lies hope, a hope that what was once whispered in fear becomes shouted in defiance. A hope that the truth, no matter how painful, can still save us from the void. She has crossed the threshold, and with her voice, a new story begins.